and justice as part of their series of talks that are happening today and tomorrow. So please check out their talks. They've got a lot of really great ones, including this one. So we're grateful for their co-sponsorship. I'm also grateful for the support of the BCLA Dean's Office, Ryan Yandel, Allison Mullen, and Abigail Davis. Last summer, Yunji Wang in Asian and Asian American Studies also provided invaluable help in developing the overarching structure for this year's series of talks. I've also been assisted by Amy Woodson Bolton in history, Evelyn McDonald in journalism, Mona Seymour in urban and environmental studies, and Trevor Zink, who's in the Department of Management and the director of the honors program. All of those folks have served on a planning committee and provided a lot of really great ideas for topics and speakers. Before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva people and their neighbors whose ancestors ruled the area we now call Southern California for thousands of years. We pay respects to the members of the elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands. Indigenous peoples of Southern California have survived 3 conquering regimes and still thrive today in an unbroken chain linking past to present. As we think together about climate change, justice, and health this semester, I hope we all gain a greater appreciation for the interlocking processes that continue to cause disruption, displacement, loss, and death in highly inequitable ways across species inhabiting the planet, past and present. Let the resistance and resilience of the Gabrielina and Tongva people and their neighbors be in our hearts and minds as we sit with complexity and different feelings, hopefully moving towards action to reduce injustice, suffering, and loss. It's now my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Nadia Kim, professor in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies here at LMU. Dr. Kim's research focuses on US race and citizenship inequalities regarding Korean and Asian Americans and South Koreans, race and nativist racism in Los Angeles, immigrant women's activist politics of the body and emotions, environmental racism and classism, and comparative racialization of Latinx, Asian Americans, and Black Americans. Throughout her work, Dr. Kim's approach centers neoliberalism, transnationality, and intersectionality of race, gender, and class and citizenship. She is author of the multi-award-winning book, Imperial Citizens, Koreans and the Race from Seoul to LA, and several award-winning journal articles on race and assimilation and on racial attitudes. Dr. Kim has long organized on issues of immigrant rights, affirmative action, and environmental justice, which supports and deepens her scholarly work. In Dr. Kim's most recent book, Refusing Death, Immigrant Women and the Fight for Environmental Justice in LA, she chronicles the embodied, emotive, and citizenship politics of Asian and Latina immigrant women's fight for cleaner air in Los Angeles. Her talk today is entitled Refusing Death, How
Protection Protocols
and the Fight for Environmental Justice in Los Angeles. So with that, I want to welcome Dr. Kim. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today. I know you're a parent of young children, which means you've had kids at home, school interruptions, so we're especially grateful for your time today. Welcome.
Thanks so much for that acknowledgement and for that kind introduction in the midst of that Big Brother announcement, whatever that was. Thank you so much to everyone who's here. I know you're so incredibly busy. I'm so appreciative of your time. I should just state at the outset, please excuse the Michael Jackson glove look, but I burned my hand very, very badly, multitasking. So sorry about that. I do want to acknowledge Professor Rachel Washburn, the director of the Bellarmineforum, Professor Yunji Wang for the original invitation. Thank you so much also to the CSJ Center for Reconciliation and Justice for inviting me here and co-sponsoring. So I am going to share my presentation and get right into it because we have a lot to talk about today. If there are any questions that arise, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. I'd be happy to engage with you. I'm basically drawing on various parts of my book, Refusing Death. And so a lot more extensive evidence and explanation is in that book, okay? All right. So one of the first questions I like to answer is, why does this matter? Why is what I'm saying today important? Why is this study worth doing? And one of the most important things I want to emphasize is that we can't really understand race or racism without centering environmental racism. This is something from Professor David Pello, who came earlier in the forum. And as a race scholar myself, this is something I can't, we can't underappreciate, right? And by extension, there's no classism or class injustice without centering environmental classism, okay? And one of the ways we can think about this is that when we think about, racism, for example, we talk about race discrimination in the workplace, right? But oftentimes we don't recognize that if people of color, immigrants of color, are working. Oh, I think someone needs to mute because I hear people talking.
Anything at all about Haiti's noble heritage.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. I'm not sure what to do, Rachel. So at any rate, if immigrants of color and people of color are working in exploitative, hazardous, dangerous environments, we need to call that environmental racism, okay? I'll address this in my talk as well, but schools are located often next to polluting sites or industries, and therefore are also a part of the environmental racism discussion, okay? The other thing is that, we talk a lot about climate justice, and climate justice is a major theme, thankfully, of this Bellarmine Forum. But one thing we don't talk about enough is that people of color in urban environments as well, and the global South are disproportionately hurt, right, by climate catastrophes. And so climate change or climate crises are not just about non-human nature and things that kind of happen out there, but climate justice is about environmental racism and classism as well, okay? And so, in the words of R&B theorist named Beyonce, we do need to ring the alarm on climate justice because it centrally rests on environmental racism and classism as well, okay? Now, the other major reason why this matters is because of the violence and neglect from neoliberal racial capitalism, and that is a lot. I'm going to break that down in a moment. And because of the rise in anti-immigrant, or what we call white nationalism. Unauthorized immigrants and documented immigrants are increasingly relying on grassroots community activism for political change and political empowerment, okay? Now, just to talk about neoliberal racial capitalism quickly, because it is a basis for my talk today, you can just think of neoliberalism as the shift towards the market dictating government policy and practice. So the market ultimately has come to dictate everything. And this really began with the watershed rise of Reagan conservatism in the 1980s. That's when you start seeing neoliberalism begin to crystallize, okay? And by virtue of this market-driven state, that means that no longer are we a social welfare state, right? We've gutted kind of that whole social welfare foundation that, for example, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is known for, right? Why we have Social Security, Medicare, et cetera. And so we're gutting that social welfare state and the social safety net, and basically making sure that we cater to corporations, Wall Street, industry, okay? And one of the ways that we cater to them is not just by virtue of let them have runaway profit, right? But it's also weak to little regulation. So that's obviously very, very important for my talk today about clean air, because one of the reasons why Los Angeles has the worst air quality in the country and why there's so much air pollution around the globe is because there has been, unfettered sort of license given to industry and corporations to pollute, okay? So even though there's government agencies to regulate, right, what pollutes the air, those agencies have really catered to industry and corporations, okay? So another part of this neoliberal equation is it has become an issue of hyper-individualism, where everything's explained through hyper-individualism, okay? Whether you make it or you don't in life is because of you and you only, right? And if you don't make it, then too bad. Okay, so we've come to this, we already had individualism before already, all of you know Adam Smith and all of that, but we have come to an era of hyper-individualism, okay? The last important point about racial capitalism and intersectional racial capitalism, what that basically means is that capitalism was founded, created, and sustains itself based on racialized differences that have been imposed on people, okay? So before, some people would argue, well, you know, race had nothing to do with the beginnings and the, you know, sustaining of capitalism. That's not true. Okay, so if you're interested in that, please refer to the works of Cedric Robinson. Okay. All right, so as far as immigrants increasingly relying on grassroots community activism, one of the social patterns is that immigrant women of color and unauthorized immigrant women among them are leading these grassroots community movements. Okay, we know very little about them. We also know very little about the fact that these immigrant-led movements in our global cities like Los Angeles are among the most dynamic social movements that are really shifting and changing the political landscape. Again, we don't know enough about them, okay? In addition to what I was talking about earlier, that racism needs to center environmental racism. For example, we can't understand the COVID-19 pandemic without centering environmental racism and classism, because although this has not been studied enough and popularized enough in the news media, one of the reasons why African-American, Latinx, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous peoples are suffering the highest rates of COVID contraction and death is because their bodies and health have already been greatly compromised by disproportionate environmental pollution of their communities, okay? So the two go hand in hand. So the general research question I'm asking for today is, when it comes to environmental justice, also called EJ, as many of you probably know, how does having unhealthy bodies shape the politics that the Asian and Latina immigrant women activists I met prioritize, okay? So the next question is, how do race, class, immigration, and I'll also be integrating gender wherever I can, shape these women's political views, identities, and strategies? One of the catalysts for my research question is the incredible scholarship that some of you have already read by women of color in the intersectional school that really addressed how one of the ways that people of color, women of color, etc., are oppressed is by virtue of, you know, dominant groups deeming them more embodied, right? They're more in their bodies than in their minds. Therefore, they're more visceral or animalistic, or they're more emotional, right? Which is seen as bad, right? Versus the dominant groups being more rational and civil, right? And detached, okay? So that is a major form of oppression that is unleashed against groups of color and women of color, as you can imagine, right? The specifics of that being hyperfecund, right? Having too many babies, being sexually excessive, right? This is something that social scientists in particular, I think, need to be exploring more and studying more in terms of their research. And so that is a guidepost for my study and my talk today, okay? So I just want to briefly go over the data and method. I don't have a ton of time for this, but obviously it's important to share with you what I actually did. So between 2008 to 10 and then 2011 to 13, there was a break there for the birth of my first child. I conducted about 3.5 years of participant observation. So I was doing ethnography, and essentially I was going to meetings, you know, protests, social events, social gatherings, and I basically assisted with the organizing and volunteered and helped out in whatever ways I could, right? Including putting away chairs, helping take care of kids, things like that, okay? The second form of method I used was interviews. I did almost 50 interviews with the community activists, the leaders of the organizations, as well as members and allies. So people who weren't necessarily part of the organizations, but were allies. And mostly worked with 5 community-based organizations, CBOs, and 3 supplementary organizations. Now, one thing I really want to underscore here, so as not to give the wrong impression, is that these CBOs and organizations didn't necessarily work together. And that was because they were very focused on the communities in which they live, which many of you know are quite racially segregated, especially in a city like Los Angeles. So for example, if you go here to the bullet points, the predominantly Mexican-American organizations like Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, like Community Partners Council, like Coalition for a Safe Environment, East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, Semillas de Esperanza, Latinos in Action. Okay, they mostly focused on predominantly Mexican or Latinx communities, which had a large number of working class unauthorized immigrants. And also the reason why some of these organizations couldn't work across racial and cultural lines was because of language barriers, right? So the predominantly Latinx organizations mostly spoke in Spanish, okay? I also worked with a predominantly Filipinx organization named People's Corps. I'm so glad that I was able to work with them during the time that I did, because about 3 years after I left the field, they did have to disband. So at least I captured a moment of their history. And this organization mostly services the city of Carson, because there are a lot of Filipinx Americans that live in Carson, and then nearby Los Angeles, okay? And I should add that the predominantly Mexican American working class organizations worked in Wilmington, West Long Beach primarily, okay? And then probably the most well-known and renowned organization for environmental justice in California is called Communities for a Better Environment, or CBE. And they service a multiracial populace that includes these groups, as well as Black Americans, Pacific Islanders, etc. They also have a multiracial staff, okay? And they also work anywhere from Huntington Park down to the Port of LA and Long Beach, okay, which I'll be telling you about more in a moment. The last method I used was documents analysis. So I analyzed hundreds and hundreds of pages of everything from agendas to presentations so that I could triangulate what I was seeing in the field and what I was hearing in the interviews with what they were actually documenting in their flyers, their reports, etc. And that was one of the ways they asked me to help them, is that they have very little time to actually document what they're doing. And they're so grateful to have me and my students really help with documenting what it is they actually did over time. All right, so environmental injustice today. Relatively quickly, what I want to go over, and I want to start in this bottom right corner, is how do you and I get all the goods that we buy on a day-to-day basis, right? From clothes to cars to electronics to food to tchotchkes, right? Well, we get it through cargo container ships coming into the port of LA and Long Beach. Okay, this is the largest seaport in all of the United States. It is the 9th largest and busiest in the entire world. Okay, so many of you know that we are no longer a manufacturing economy. So most of what we have is manufactured in China or elsewhere. China is quite far away. The cargo containers that come all the way from China and other manufacturing nations run on diesel oil, okay? So that's one source of pollution, okay? Lots of idling that happens, okay? Then those goods that you and I buy are put on these, Mack trucks, okay? And they drive up the freeways and deliver them to the Targets and the Costcos and the Best Buys and the car dealerships in California, but also all across the United States, okay? So diesel through freeway systems, right? Then you have these goods also placed on trains, okay? So these trains also go all over California and the country. These trains, surprise, surprise, also run on diesel, okay? So diesel emissions through these rail yards, okay? Then you have the entire oil apparatus that needs to, prop up this goods movement that I've just talked about, right? In order to make diesel oil, you need oil refineries. And so the communities I studied literally live right next to oil refineries, which are mini cities unto themselves. So many of you have probably driven by these, or you've driven by San Pedro. So you've seen these, but maybe not necessarily given it an extra thought besides, wow, that's pretty gargantuan, right? And the other reason why oil refineries are needed is anything that's made requires oil, from bread to a plastic toy, right? And so what we need to understand is that LA is not just the city of Hollywood and fashion, but it's also the city of oil. Okay, it is the largest urban oil field in the country, even though that's not the way we promote LA normally. Okay, I just wanted to give you a sense of the expansiveness of the ports of LA and Long Beach. Understand that it's not just diesel pollution that's coming out of here, but lots of oil spills, lots of spills of contaminants and debris. Okay. So sorry for this, not so great screenshot, but I just wanted to give you a map, just to give you a visual geographical sense of where we're talking about. So this is the port of LA and Long Beach right here, okay, where all the goods are coming through. It is often put on trucks that run on the 710 freeway, and the 710 freeway is actually the most cancerous freeway in the United States. It is the cause of the most number of cancers. And so one of the things that journalist named Aaron Fleischman, I believe his name is. He says that, we often think of racist monuments as Confederate statues, but we actually need to recognize freeways as racist monuments, because freeways are often built in and through neighborhoods of color, okay, often against the residents' will, okay? So, then there's disproportionate exposure, okay? The cities, as I mentioned, that it was concentrated in and the organizing was concentrated in was Carson, Wilmington, West Long Beach, okay? And here we are up here. Okay, so connecting back to my point earlier about neoliberalism and how it manifests, one of the ways that I found in my study that's really important to frame the talk today is that it's not just that the fossil fuel industry of oil and gas, are polluting sort of with reckless abandon, right? And with very little regulation or limitations on them. But it's also that there are many ways in which they deploy power through the use of emotional or affective structures, right? And this is also where I would like social science to go more in the direction of, is to really pay attention, not just to kind of the emotional lives and tendencies among the bottom up, for example, among like how people of color are affected by racism, or how movements really rely on emotions to really, try to win goals and victories, right? But to really think about how really powerful entities like fossil fuel industries and regulatory agencies use emotional tactics and emotional kind of norms to also unleash their power and to maintain their power. So what do I mean by that? So the first example I want to use is how, if you actually read the websites of Valero, Shell Oil, Exxon, Marathon, etc., right, you will find that they are always talking about how much they care about the environment and how much they care about the communities that are being hurt by pollution, right? And so I don't think the irony is lost on you and me that this is the fossil fuel industry, okay, one of the biggest polluters across the globe, that is saying how much they care about environmental pollution, okay? And one of the elements of this that's most important is that this whole notion of the ethics of care and of concern, right, for communities or neighbors or children, that came predominantly from the women who ended up leading most of these environmental justice movements, like the activists I studied. but there's absolutely no credit or attribution given to them, let alone no self-consciousness about the incredible hypocrisy and contradiction and nonsensical nature of the fossil fuel industry, talking about how much they care about polluting, but then polluting with reckless abandon, right? So in this way, this kind of emotive care and concern is also co-opting the environmental justice movement without giving it any credit or due. Now, another example I can use to flesh this out is if you look at their websites, and I have a whole chapter on this, so I only can use like very small examples here, brief examples, but oftentimes in their PR talk, they claim to fix the problem or be moving towards fixing the problem of environmental pollution without ever acknowledging that they've created the problem, right? They've been a major player in the problem. And so in many ways, what they're doing is they also kind of co-opt the environmental justice movement by taking undue credit for the improvements in the air quality or the improvements in bringing air monitors to schools so students don't get sick from the oil industry next door, right? So yeah, again, the hypocrisy, right? Another way you see this emotive power from corporate America is through the kinds of false choices that it offers without any acknowledgement of the distress that these false choices cause. For example, the mothers that I studied, the immigrant mothers of color that I studied. So here's an example of a false choice. When I was working with Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, one of their main goals was always to make sure to oppose schools that were sited really close to the freeway or really close to oil and diesel pollution and other forms, right? And that was basically their modus operandi. But one day, the mostly Latinx immigrant, activists, the mothers, came up to them and said, please don't oppose this one school because this new school that they're citing is within walking distance. So because most of us don't have cars, we have to make the lesser of evils choice. Do we allow a school to slowly, make sick and, basically unleash premature death on our children, or we make sure that there's a school that they can go to, get educated at, that they can actually access, right, as a family? And so they said, well, we have to choose, the lesser of the evils. We have to choose the school that's within walking distance. And the point is that neoliberalism and the fossil fuel industry, for example, that props that up, that's a false choice, right? We don't have to rely on fossil fuels. We don't have to build schools in communities of color right next to freeways, right? But that's what they make it seem, that like, this is all we have, so choose. And this causes, a lot of emotional distress on these immigrant activists, which will be an important point later, okay? So here's a quick example of Valero Oil, how much they care about you and the earth. This is directly from their website. So quote, Valero ranked highest among independent refiners in Newsweek's 2017 green rankings of top 500 US publicly traded companies for environmental performance, okay? This is like Coca-Cola saying that they ranked highest among independent, in terms of the health rankings of the top 500 US publicly traded companies for health performance, okay? There's absolutely no consciousness about the hypocrisy and of the nonsensical nature of boasting about your environmental performance when you're a fossil fuel company, okay? So just to kind of talk about the importance of not seeing environmental justice and school reform or educational justice as separate, this is SVU Elementary in Bell Gardens. This is one of the most infamous cases of environmental racism and classism in the US. You see this chrome plating company literally blowing toxins onto these little kids as they go to school. As of today, I believe that 28 students and teachers, mostly students, have been diagnosed with cancer. A large number of these students and teachers have already passed away. Some of them passed away at a very young age, okay? And some of the teachers and staff had miscarriages, okay? And so it wasn't until major environmental justice organizing by Bell Gardens and Communities for a Better Environment and other environmental justice groups that finally they were able to shut this down. But it was literally decades after the illnesses and the cancers had already started. Okay. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is how, as I mentioned earlier in my research question, the sense of racism and nativist racism against immigrants and gendered racism against women of color, right, really rests on inequalities and injustices of the body. I thought that Johnny, who was one of the youth environmental justice leaders of CBE, Communities for a Better Environment, he really put it eloquently in terms of describing why he sees politics and these injustices as thoroughly embodied, okay? So he says, environmental justice is not an identity, right? Sorry, for some reason this share bar is covering my, people don't see identity like being Guatemateco or Chicano, but to me it is. It has so much to do with where I live, where I grew up in the United States. So a quick note, a lot of times when we talk about identity politics, we very much go to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, right? I mean, those are the things we go to. But what he's saying is that we don't go to environmental justice, okay? So that's why I hold environmental justice dear to my heart. EJ allowed me to do that without having to focus on just one identity. It's that I'm part of my community and my environment and surroundings, which is not just pollution, by the way, he says. I can't take it away from me. So what's so instructive about what he's saying here, and that many activists echoed, is that I see environmental justice as my identity just as much as my race, ethnicity, my class, my sexual orientation, etc. Okay. And he says the reason for that is that you can not literally separate my environment that I grew up in, right? The hyper polluted communities I grew up in California from myself, my human body, right? From my mental, my emotional state, okay? You can't take it away from me. So there's no way that I would think of my identities and not conjure environmental injustice, right? We are the embodied community, okay? We embody pollution, sickness, yes, but obviously there's beautiful things of the community as well, okay? I'm not sure why. Let me see here. Okay, there we go. So in this context of thinking of themselves as the embodied community, how do the activists understand racism and classism? And how do they draw political lines as a result? Okay. So one of my findings is that they drew political boundaries around their community, thinking about like, who is the us? Who are the people we're fighting for and defending, right? They deem those people as those who embody classism or racism, right? But also embody emotional inequalities or emotional injustices. So this is also a very important way of kind of expanding our notion of embodiment, not just thinking of it as the corporeal body, right? But also thinking of it as the emotions that reside, right, in and through our bodies, okay? So one of the ways they also kind of come to understand who are we, right? Well, we are the people who practice a moral kind of citizenship. And by that, they don't mean citizenship like we go out and vote. I mean, most of them can't go out and vote. They're unauthorized, right? They don't mean like eventually want to be part of the formal electoral system so that we can run for office and become president one day. They're not as concerned about that. Yes, definitely concerned with becoming legalized in the future. But in terms of what was, part of their heart and their passionate politics was the sense that citizenship, the true meaning of citizenship, the moral meaning of citizenship is that we are taking care of each other in a society that is, neoliberally neglectful and violent, right? It's violent towards our bodies and our emotional states as well, okay? And so one of the ways that I kind of capture this is that, especially the Latinx immigrants, they tended to talk about they are the healthy, wealthy, right? We are the embodied sick, right? When I talk to the predominantly AAPI, Asian and Pacific Islander immigrant activists, they would call them like the white healthy, right? Though that race is healthier than we are, right? And it's because they unleash environmental classism and racism. Therefore, they are immoral, okay? So we'll get into this. So one of the other major findings of my research is that, as I just hinted at, When I talked to the mostly Filipinx American activists, and there were other Asian Americans as well, but the majority were Filipinx. When I asked, what is the main cause of this environmental injustice, they would pinpoint racism as the most salient. So I wanted to explore why. Because in contrast, and much to my surprise, when I asked the predominantly Mexican Latina immigrants what was the main cause of the environmental justice, they actually pinpointed classism, okay? And I was just surprised because in the environmental justice movement and in the environmental justice scholarship, it's been well established that racism is typically the most salient explanation for why there are environmental injustices. So what do I mean by that? That means that even middle-class communities of color tend to experience worse contamination and pollution than low-income white communities, okay? And so because of that, I expected the Latinx activists to say, oh, this is environmental racism, right? But actually they really wanted to emphasize that it was class injustice that was the biggest problem. So we're gonna explore why, okay? Okay, so starting with the Latina case, when I applied a transnational lens, which I've done through all of my work, it became very apparent why class and class injustice was so important to them, okay? So this was a perfect example of an exchange I had with Marta, who is an unauthorized Mexican immigrant activist. And I asked her, you know, do you think they are disproportionately contaminating your community because they're mostly Anglo and you're mostly like, you know, Latinos and mostly Mexican? And she replied, it's not just because they're Anglo. Over there in Mexico, we are Mexican, and it's the same thing when there's politics. They don't pay attention to us. To put it simply, they're people who are not in a lower class like us. They separate themselves from us and don't know the people. They live near the mountains and forget about us, right? So their physical bodies are healthier, their emotional states are healthier, right? Who cares about us, right? But what's really important about this point is she's saying, no, they do it in Mexico to us Mexican people. So how can we just say this is an Anglo issue, right? Or a racism issue, okay? In a similar vein, when I talked to Celia, who's also an unauthorized Mexican immigrant, and I asked her why she and her parents weren't that interested in getting involved in politics while they were living in Mexico before immigrating, and why they hadn't maintained like a transnational interest in Mexican politics or Mexican social justice politics. This was her answer, so I'm going to move to the second line. Well, what happens there is that where I'm from is a very small town, and there, whoever was the one with the most money would just go and make themselves the leader. So I asked, but did the person who made the rules, were they a good person who did things with justice? Or Celia, sometimes, depending on the money. And, you know, she made a wry smile. So essentially, she elaborated in our interview that she thinks that politics is corrupt in Mexico because it's completely corrupted by money. And those with money do influential things for other people with money, okay? So in this sense, you know, going back to the sense of our community is embodied, more specifically, what the Latina immigrants were saying was that it's an embodied classism that really defines our experience as a community and separates us from the healthy, wealthy. Okay, so this came out really clearly in an exchange with Laura. Laura is also a community leader in the movement. And so she kept saying the word my community, our community. So this was early on in my fieldwork. And I said, when you say community, do you mean the people who live in the area? Or she said, no, not only as immigrants, no, it's the low income. I'm not talking about Latinos, Black, or other racial ethnic groups who live here, okay? Again, she's talking about the impoverished, all right? So through this sense of us versus them having these, you know, unequal class experiences of the body, you know, what they were often conveying is that not only are the wealthy physically more healthy, but they're also emotionally healthier because they do not go through the distress, the depression related to environmental injustice that we have to go through, right? And the difficulties of organizing. And because of that, they're ignorant of what's really going on, and they're non-empathic or non-empathetic. And as you can see here, it's really important to understand that this has become a major leitmotif, right, or a political calculation and strategy of the environmental justice movement, because it's women and mothers who are really concerned about the emotional health and the emotional well-being of them, their neighbors, their families, their children. And so I thought this was really articulated lucidly by Lauda again. So she had told me that she really liked Obama, President Obama. She couldn't quite, pinpoint why. So I asked her, okay, if you ever became a citizen, would you focus more on electoral politics? And she was emphatic. She said, never. My community is first. It's because the community needs to be educated. We need to include ourselves. So I asked, do you feel like Obama or the national level, representatives at the national level, do they know local issues? And she scoffed, no, they have no idea, because they live in places where they don't know anything about pollution. Okay, again, they're physically, emotionally healthier, therefore ignorant, therefore they don't empathize. They're clueless, okay, and they don't care. And she even thinks that about the President Obama administration, who she actually liked, right, because of this major divide. Okay, so for just issues of time, I want to move on to why and in what ways the predominantly Filipina Asian ethnic activists really pinpointed that racism was the main cause of their struggle and the main way that they had to organize and resist back, right? So the way that I knew this is because, unlike the Latina immigrants, when the Filipina activists talk, they would lead with our Filipino community, or we minorities, or we people of color. Of course, discussions of class would get woven in, but that's not what they led with, right? They didn't lead with, we are being overpolluted because we're less economically privileged than the elites, okay? And so the other way that I saw this was that, interestingly, they rarely organize an environmental justice event without centering Phil-Am or Panay Pinoy history and culture, okay? So examples of that could be, say we would have an environmental justice event to, educate the community about the oil refineries and about the way schools are being polluted upon, and the goods movement pollution through the freeways and the rail yards and the ports, right? Well, they would always make sure to have a segment in these political events whereby they would give civic awards to, Panays and Pinoys who were doing a lot of community work and social justice work for the community, or to students who were doing well in school. They would always have Filipinx food, right? A big spread, also to kind of spread awareness about Filipinx ethno-racial culture. But one of the other signal ways that I saw it was in always making sure to work towards the celebration of Larry Itliong. Some of you may know Larry Itliong already, but Larry Itliong and other Manongs like Philip Veracruz and other Pinoy farm workers, right? These men were actually the ones that convinced Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to strike, okay, as the United Farm Workers, right? Originally, Cesar Chavez was kind of hesitant and wasn't sure and didn't know if he could get the Mexican farm workers to come along and strike, actually walk off the job, right? They need the job, right? They need the income. And so it's only now, because of the work of environmental justice organizers like Pia, one of the Filipino leaders in Carson for EJ, and other Filipinx and AAPI activists, that Carson officially has the Celebrate Larry Itliong Day, okay? And I believe now California is going to adopt it more broadly. The importance of Larry Itliong is not just that he was a labor activist, right? But that he was actually an environmental justice activist, because he fought against the use of pesticides, especially DDT being sprayed all over the Mexican, Filipinx, and other farm workers, right? He advocated, therefore, for organic produce, okay? And so this is where we need to make the connection again and see how labor movements and environmental justice movements are often inextricable, right? Because these farm workers were being, killed, right, at their workplace by DDT, etc. So that's environmental racism and classism right there, okay? One of the other major reasons why the Filipinx activists really honed in on race had to do with the fact that unlike most of the Mexican and Latinx immigrant activists that really were unhappy with political corruption in Mexico, didn't want to follow exactly what was going on because it was depressing for them, and hadn't really been involved prior to immigrating because either poverty didn't allow it, right? Sometimes it is a privilege to be able to go out and do this stuff. Or because, like we just learned from Celia, it was just the people with money that ran politics in Mexico, right? They did do a lot of volunteering, which they did see as central to their community. So I do want to add that. But they weren't involved in formal political social justice movements before or transnationally after getting here. Now, the Filipinx activists were. So Pia, as I showed you in the picture earlier, demonstrates this through this long narrative. And sorry, it's a little bit long, but it's actually really, really important. Because what this narrative demonstrates is that one of the reasons she maintains a very strong racial lens when looking at environmental injustices locally in Carson and LA is because she's very focused on the imperialist environmental racism that US colonialism and neo-colonialism continues, in terms of contaminating and polluting the Philippines today, okay? So she says, my dad, he was a union leader. I grew up debating politics. My political position was mainly in the student movement in the 70s, fighting the Marcos dictatorship, okay? I was already active with the women's movement in the Philippines in '84. I was setting up Gabriela. Gabriela's a very renowned NGO, Filipina NGO. Right now, because we live in Carson, I'm more interested in the environment because I can feel the impact. So another group, the Philippine Network, had pulled out when the military bases, the US military bases, were not there in the Philippines anymore. So one of the things that you guys need to know, if you don't know, is that the US has mostly pulled most of its bases out of the Philippines, okay? That was in 1992. When they pulled out, we felt that it was still necessary to put up an environment group because the human rights had gone hand in hand with the environment issue. And I asked, are you saying because the bases, the US bases in the Philippines had polluted so much? Yeah. And though we were wanting to do just military, international military issues, we got pulled in because Greenpeace came in and we talked about plastics, that the global north, including the US, dumps plastics in the Philippines. They dump batteries, okay, which, as you know, is highly toxic. The pesticides go there, right? They dump all the tobacco from here over there in the Philippines, okay? So again, she's been highly active since she was very, very young, and she's maintained those transnational politics because the US colonialism and neocolonialism has continued this pollution that's killing Filipinos in the Philippines today, okay? So another point that I need to really underscore is that just because the Latina immigrants really identified classism as the main political beast to slay, right? And that was the main source of their sense of who are we, who are they, how are we going to fight back, right? They really emphasize embodied classism, right? That doesn't mean that they didn't see and recognize race or the way race interrelated with class. So one of the ways we can think about it is that they put class as, the master injustice, but they saw class as mediating race. Classism is mediating racism, okay? So this comes through in an example like from Celia, sorry. She says, so I asked her, why do you think that they disproportionately, pollute your communities with freeways, rail yards, oil, right? She says, it can be because they might think that immigrants only come to take from the country and not give to the country. So I said, so sometimes do you think it has to do with being Latino or no? And she says, yes, okay. In similar fashion, just because the AAPI activists really pinpointed environmental racism as the master injustice, they still saw racism as mediating classism. So a really good example here is Cindy. She's a Samoan American teacher in Carson. She teaches K through 12. She worked very actively with People's Corps. And she was very, very concerned about not just the fact that America has false images of Samoans as just being uneducated football players, right? But the fact that she underscored the uneducated part, right? And so throughout Cindy's interview, she often emphasized, look, A lot of people look at Samoans as some, impoverished Pacific Islander community. Most people I know, we're educated, we're going to college, we're making waves politically and civically. So it's all hogwash, right? So, she understands that oppression is also coming through that sense of those are just poor Pacific Islanders, okay? So I just want to go through the implications of my findings and wrap up. So one of the ways in which I really have kind of tried to shore up the findings and think more broadly, and as a race scholar, I don't take this lightly at all. But given my findings among the Latina environmental justice activists in this port industrial, belt of LA, I wonder if sometimes university theorists can be too race focused when street theorists are not, right? And sometimes I wonder if it's because of too much of a divide between the university and communities on the ground that we're sometimes talking different languages and conceptualizing, these injustices in different ways, okay? So this would be a call for more university and community partnership, right? And especially align the community to lead in those partnerships. The other implication of my findings is we definitely need more multidisciplinary work. And that was the only way I came to my findings, okay? So I didn't just work within environmental justice sociology, but I also drew on my training in ethnic studies, Asian American and Pacific Islander studies, in women's and gender and sexuality studies, in American studies, okay? And if I hadn't been able to coalesce those literatures, I would not have been able to kind of use the lenses that I did to get the findings that I did, okay? And in this sense, more specifically, I believe that sociology and environmental justice scholarship itself needs to be more embodied, affective, meaning emotional, transnational, and empire and citizenship focused, okay? It also needs to center neoliberalism more in terms of when it goes out and does ethnography or goes out and, does interviews or surveys, okay? And so in this way, hopefully we can bring these disciplines together. The last point I want to make is I believe sociology, especially in comparison to the other disciplines, is still a little bit too methodologically nationalistic. What do I mean by that? Meaning that we often kind of conceive of everything as the nation state, right? Or we see it as like the bounded nation state without realizing the importance of all of this global and transnational cross-pollination, right? Between nation states. And we kind of don't think about the importance of really getting down to the local, right? Obviously, my study is very much one about the local. So a perfect example of this is based on my findings, it led me to another question, which is, given how much the Mexican immigrants, were unhappy with the way they were treated as impoverished people in Mexico, this should prompt us to now study how did Mexico talk about and treat their own poor, right? And look at the convergences between the way the US talks about Latinx immigrants as the poor or as racial others today. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. I'd be happy to take any questions, anything that you needed on clarification, or you just wanted to know more about the evidence, because I only got to share little bits and pieces given the time constraint. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Kim. That was a wonderful talk. You gave us a lot to think about. I'm going to open up the floor. I'll enable the chat, which I think I've enabled, but I'll make sure.
Yeah, I see someone's already said, okay, yeah. Great. You're welcome, Julia.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So I'll let, I'm also, I hope Evelyn McDonald is still here because she was going to help out with the Q&A, but I know she's
okay. I am here.
Okay, good. I know you've had some stuff.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Nadia. That was fantastic. That was really interesting. I live in San Pedro. And, my son went to high school in Carson. Oh,
wow.
And since nobody else has a question yet, I'm sure they're coming. Let me go ahead and ask you a question. What did you do any research or talk to people about the recent smell issues in Carson, and how does that relate to were the activists involved in that?
Yes, that is an excellent question. So I haven't talked to them, for example, probably it's been a couple months now. I did a little bit of follow-up field research with them, but smell pollution was something they brought up regularly. Okay. And I think what's also important when we're talking about environmental injustices, I didn't have time to talk about it today, but it is a major feature of my book. You know, I focus mostly on the air pollution, but what they're also fighting against is the injustice of smell pollution, light pollution, and noise pollution, right? Because if they are talking about how so much of this rests on embodied inequalities, right? Physical and emotional injustices, you know, we are talking about the senses, right? We're talking about the full embodied experience. And so they often addressed how their lives were made so much more stressful, right? They couldn't sleep because of either noise or light pollution, right? And also just the pollution that comes along with building freeways, right? The building of industry, right? In and around their communities. And they talked a lot about, to your point, smell, okay? And one of the reasons why smell becomes so political is because the way that these regulatory, right, in quote, agencies basically maintain the status quo is they'll say, if you smell something toxic, right, give us a call, right? If we have enough calls about it, we'll send out an official, right, or, you know, a worker to come out and, you know, sort of do a smell test, right? And what the activists constantly complained about is the smells were so toxic that sometimes they would faint and sometimes their children would faint, right? But these workers would come out and literally say, I don't smell anything. I don't smell anything, right? Nothing's coming up on the monitor, right? And so what ends up happening is these residents don't call them anymore. Why should they bother, right? So again, this is another example of how embodied oppression, right? Embodied injustices are being unleashed here, but also being maintained, right? By way of my embodied experience is completely different from yours. I don't smell anything. Smoke? What smoke? I don't see the black cloud. I mean, that is literally what these agencies are doing. And so that's why, as you heard the immigrant activists say, we have to take matters into our own hands. They're doing absolutely nothing. So thanks so much for your question.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you. And we definitely have some questions in the chat
Yeah.
now.
Mhm.
I will try to keep up with them, as a matter of fact, which I'm not sure I'm doing the best job of. Okay, so Rory asks, given that asthma rates and exposure to cancer-causing chemicals are pressing an urgent issue, how can we help these communities escape pollution when the polluting forces are a part of an infrastructure that doesn't seem to be making any immediate changes, and the members of these communities do not have the economic capacity to simply live somewhere else?
That's an excellent question, Rory. And it is urgent, right? Because people are getting sick, asthma, cancer, and they're experiencing premature death, right? And the way the activists would respond to this is that you need to organize with us, you know? What's so interesting, and this is also a testament to moral citizenship, right? One of the sort of emotive discursive tactics that the officials use, or corporate officials use, like from the oil refineries, fossil fuel, they'll say, why don't you just move, right? If you moved, I mean, there are low-income areas that are slightly cleaner, right? Why don't you just move, right? Okay, obviously that's a very offensive question that's rooted in various privileges. But what the activists will say is, I'm not moving. I absolutely refuse to move, because if I move, who is going to protect and fight for these communities? My neighbors, right? Okay, so maybe if I move, I'll have slightly better air quality and maybe I'll live a little bit longer, or maybe I won't die. But the point is that that's not what life is about. Life is about being a moral citizen for your fellow neighbors that are suffering, right? And so in that vein, what they would say is, come over, right, to our communities, right? Listen to us, get to know us, right? listen to the ways that we would ask for your help, right? That was one of the ways that I gained entree to these movements, right? Because I did it kind of in an unconventional way. Normally, scholars are part of the movement first and then they study it. But of course, I make life more difficult for myself. I had just moved from Boston, where I had my first job, to this job at Loyola. And I had to start my second project. My first book had just been published. And so, you know, one of the ways I sort of was able to gain trust and build relationships, and all of this I got from ethnographic research, by the way, and methodology. I just listened to what they needed and what they thought would be most helpful and how best I could service their movement. And I just think the more of us that do that, and the stronger the pressure becomes, right? That's when you actually see action, or some action on the part of the regulatory agencies, or, at least the agencies kind of pressuring industry to be better and to do better. There's maybe a little bit more regulation. So let me give you just one quick example. One of the campaigns was the expansion of the 710 freeway, already the most cancerous freeway in the United States of America, right? And one of the reasons why it wasn't expanded ultimately, after years and years and years of studies and protests and meetings and all that, is because of community pressure from these activists that I studied, but also allies, right? People coming in and supporting their movement. So I think that's one of the best and most immediate ways. If any students are interested, you can contact me and I'll try to get you in touch with these organizations. They're not always good at responding. They're incredibly resource strapped, okay? But usually, they can figure out ways that students could be really helpful to the cause.
Thank you. Juliet, who is in the Management 3690 class, says, thank you for speaking to us. And she is from Torrance and is familiar with the local refineries there.
Yeah.
She says, vulnerable communities like the ones you mentioned have been dealing with this pollution for decades. But why do you think the wealthier, less vulnerable demographics nearby seem to not care about the issue? Is it a matter of education, or something else holding people back from making a change?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you. I think it's a myriad, number of factors, right? I think part of it is that, and LA is one of the most apt examples of this, because of racial segregation, right? And LA is very spatially expansive, right? And we're very far apart from each other. So when you have more of that kind of distance, right, from communities like Huntington Park and Wilmington and Carson and West Long Beach, it's just easier to not really think about it, or, to be able to go, about your day to day without really understanding the health, physical and emotional health impacts on these communities and immigrant communities of color. I also think that, going back to my point about neoliberalism and hyper-individualism, I do really think that has weakened our sense of collectivism and the sense of serving the public good. And there's a long, expansive scholarship about this by a lot of political scientists and political theorists. So, like there's a famous book called Bowling Alone, right? We no longer have that civic and collectivistic engagement where we see that kind of interdependence and understand that, at some point, this air and this soil and this water is going to move into, whatever, playa, what are those
Palos Verdes.
Palos Verdes. Yes.
I mean, it's right next door. Absolutely.
It's right next door. I clearly don't live there, right? Or the richer parts of Long Beach, right? And then you move down into the OC, right? Or even up in Bel Air and Malibu, I could go on and on, right? And so I do think that matters. And that's why, in the United States, we have people completely unwilling to mask to save the lives of somebody else, right? Because the idea is that it violates my individual rights in this sense of hyper-individualist kind of atomizing, right? I think another reason is because of the whole real estate tax property structure, right? With the valuation of most of our important assets being our home, being linked to the beauty and the safety and the lack of environmental hazards in your community, like incinerators or oil pipelines, right? Like that working class East LA had to deal with. And so in the sense of, as long as I can keep that stuff out of my, so NIMBYism, whatever, right? Then, we're okay, we're good, right? And so I do think that's also a major part of it. Like another good example is this recent news about the supply chain logjam, right? How many news stories or how many consumers of goods did you hear say, gosh, this must be a real environmental hazard against all those immigrants and people of color who live right next to the port and the freeways, that are trying to get all this Amazon boxes, like getting it through for the holidays, et cetera, as fast as they can because there's a delay, right? Nobody was talking about them, right? And really just focused on, why is my Amazon package taking so long, right? And so again, I think that has to do with all those reasons that I just cited earlier. Do I think if there's more kind of collective organizing together, can that change? Yes, I do think that.
Thank you. And yes, I see the pollution from the parking lot of cargo ships, which is broken up a little bit, but I mean, I see it visibly through my window right now. So
oh, wow.
it's really true that,
That's
I mean, and there's been studies that it's already added to the pollution that's already been
Yes.
documented. So, and
Yes.
Joe, who is also from San Pedro, could probably speak to this. And he has a question. He says, growing up in San Pedro, he knows many longshoremen. How can the port be convinced to be mindful about polluting our Bay Area when pollution is the least of their concerns compared to a safe work environment and operating an efficient port?
Yeah. I think, again, this is an example of kind of the false choices of neoliberal racial capitalism, in the sense that, why don't these trucking companies just make these truckers, or why don't, these companies that hire these dock workers, right? Why don't they make them full-fledged employees, right? Why don't they give them full health benefits and pensions, right? Why do they do all this neoliberal independent contracting, right? So you're not an employee of ours. We don't have to buy you a truck. You have to purchase your own truck, right? On meager wages. How are these truckers going to buy a truck that runs on eco-friendly fuel or CNG, compressed natural gas, when they make barely money enough to survive, right? We don't have to pay for all the illnesses that you get from inhaling diesel pollution from your own truck. And, like Evelyn was just saying, all the idling and sitting in parking lots and all of that, right? And that's a function of neoliberalism, right? So one of the things we have to understand is like this gig economy, right? Uber, like Airbnb, all this is a product of like neoliberalism, right? Is just companies and the government not taking responsibility for the fact that, we don't want to have full-fledged employees that we really take care of anymore, right? And so I think, again, if we kind of sort of zoom outward and broaden the lens a little bit, we really think about how do we even have to be asking these questions about, should it be a school near the freeway or a school far from the freeway that no one can get to, right? Should it be we pollute so that we can maintain the jobs for the dock workers and the truckers and all the, the people who work in the goods movement industry and oil? Or, do we maintain the health and the safety of the communities of color that are sick and dying from this, right? So, one of the things that we're seeing increasingly is more of that cross-pollination between the labor movement and the environmental justice movement. So I think if we can keep expanding on that, right? Bring in the educational justice movement, right? Immigrant rights movement, right? If we can keep bringing that in, women's rights movements, right? If we can keep bringing that in, then I think it kind of speaks to the growing of the movement that I do think is at the heart of effective change, real change.
Right, because who's feeling the effects of the idling gas more than the truck
Exactly.
drivers themselves and the longshoremen themselves are the ones most.
Exactly.
It
Yeah.
is their health that is at stake.
Yeah.
Number one.
You know what's crazy? I was reading this newspaper stories in the LA Times, if you're interested, anybody, about how there's this woman who lives right next to the port where the trucks leave. She can't even leave her house nor her children because it's so not just polluted, like just plumes of gray and brown in front of her house. Can't exercise, can't do anything right, but because it's so dangerous, right? They can't leave because they'll probably run over. So, I mean, these are the kinds of hazards nobody was talking about when people were complaining about not getting their stuff in the mail. Yeah.
Thank you. Francis Sumel asks, what is the best way to influence policymakers to put a stop to the pollution caused by BP and other large corporations?
Mm-hmm.
Also, is there no way that these corporations can be held accountable for the health issues they cause in the communities where they operate?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah. I mean, policymakers, yeah, that's a tough one in the sense that policymakers are often paid by lobbyists, right? Who work for the fossil fuel industry, who work for ports. And so that one's a really hard one. I think actually the answer is to really do your politics as locally as possible. And the reason I say that is, because policymakers tend to be like Sacramento or DC, right? Doing politics as locally as possible will force the local politicians to be as accountable as possible, right? Because they're the ones that get voted in or voted out, right, by these constituencies. They're the ones that have to deal on a daily basis, face to face, in person, right, with the environmental justice activists. And that's why the environmental justice activists are most engaged with, most concerned about local politics at the most local level. Okay. And that's why, as we saw with the commentary about the presidential administration, we only had one, but this was repeated over and again, they just really see levels outside of the local and maybe outside of the state of California as being immaterial, because it's going to be those, local municipal officials that are going to be the ones that then act or move and apply pressure upward. Okay. So I think the best thing to do is not to think bigger, but to think more narrowly. So a perfect example of this is after the 1994 Northridge earthquake, which some of us were alive to have experienced, right? It was awful. Some of the freeways in LA collapsed, right? So again, this is the ways in which environmental racism and classism is everywhere. It can even manifest in where do they decide to put the freeway rubble, right? They decided to they carted all that freeway rubble to working class Latinx immigrant community, many undocumented immigrants, right? I can't remember the exact community, but it's near the Huntington Park area, right? And the emissions, right, the concrete emissions from the freeway rubble were so bad that when the local politician, the local representative came to see it, one of his lungs collapsed, right? So it's those people, even if it takes time and constant pressure and years, right? It's those people that are actually embodying the very communities that these activists also embody, right? And base their politics on. They're the ones that are like, I have to do something. It was because of that experience that he completely advocated for the removal of La Montaña. It's called La Montaña. It was a mountain of concrete rubble. Okay, basically slowly killing the children and the residents there and the elderly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this actually follows up because it focuses on the local somewhat. Rodrigo Bos asks, are there ways that we can assist these local communities into implementing new policies in the local government to halt or slow down the generation of pollutants into the communities? Also, should we be educating more people about the issue in college campuses and town hall in order to bring more attention to these issues and bring more support to make change?
Yeah. Thank you, Rodrigo. Yeah. To start with your second question, definitely. I think, I am so thankful for this Bellarmine Forum and thankful to Rachel Washburn, because these issues, we've needed to center them for so long, and we have been, but I think you know, I think the US in particular was quite slow on the climate catastrophe. Okay. And you know, we've definitely had hiccups with different presidential administrations, et cetera, you know, denying climate change ever exists in the first place, et cetera. But, you know, I definitely think as much as we can expand, you know, and consciousness raise about this, expand the knowledge and consciousness raise, I think would be very beneficial. So again, talking about how, you know, I mean, I think we should care about other groups and other communities that we're not a part of regardless, right? But after we, basically prioritize that, we also have to think about how, you know, just like COVID-19, like as far as like environmental injustice, I mean, we're all going to be affected in some way, shape, or form. We're already being affected in some way, shape, or form, right? And so, you know, this is not just about them. I mean, this is about the future of the existence of societies, you know, I mean, literally, right? So yeah, so I would really encourage that. But again, what I would do is I would make and allow those who've either engaged with these community-based movements, these grassroots movements, or those who are representative of those movements really lead and anchor that discussion, okay, and the teaching, and the prescriptions for what can we do, right? So even what I'm saying is limited. As far as slowing down the emission of certain pollutants, you know, I do think that this environmental justice organizing has been quite influential in that regard. And even though, as I stressed in my talk, really mostly the response from regulatory agencies in corporate America is to do nothing, right? Or to give very minor concessions. You know, I do have to concede that, and it's important to concede this, that when there was enough mobilization and when there were enough bodies, right, you know, protesting or, you know, banging down politicians' doors or disrupting, you know, corporate pro forma red, you know, sort of like ceremony, you know, sort of, what are they, the pomp and circumstance, that's what I'm trying to say. Like having public meetings that, you know that they're just going to keep doing what they're doing for the most part, is you really, you know, focus on bringing out the numbers, getting people organized and mobilized, but also teaching them about the science, right? So one of the ways in which this movement has really forced, for example, these regulatory agencies to monitor benzene, right? Benzene didn't used to be monitored until Coalition for a Safe Environment and all their allies came in and said, if Wilmington is experiencing 3 times more diagnoses of cancer than the National Clean Air Act allows for, then you've got to be monitoring benzene that's coming out of these oil refineries, because we think benzene is causing a lot of these cancers, right? And it was because of that activism and all that kind of disruption and mobilization I was telling you about, that they actually now monitor benzene, okay? Now, of course, the next step is to get them to do something about the higher than normal or acceptable rates of benzene, right? So yeah, so I would encourage moving in that direction.
Thank you. I think we're really pretty much out of time.
Okay.
And I don't actually see another question, which is maybe just as well, unless anybody wants to throw in one last question. All right.
These are
Julia.
great questions.
Yeah,
Thank
they
you.
are.
I really appreciated them. And I really appreciate the pragmatic and, you know, social justice oriented basis of a lot of your questions. It's really nice to see.
Julia, you want to ask the last question?
Now, I don't think we can hear you, Julia.
Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute. I think
that's
there
okay.
was like a first of all, thank you so much for everything. I was gonna ask, we have this group inside LMU that's called Divest LMU.
Yeah.
And we've been trying to convince the school to divest from fossil fuels for years now.
Yeah.
And they keep canceling meetings, or they say, oh, we are going to vote on that on the next meeting. And the group exists for, I don't know, 10 years or something. I was going to ask if you had any advice or, yes, things that we could do inside LMU to change that.
Yeah. Julia, maybe you and I should talk separately. Feel free to email me if you would like. I'm not sure if on a recording for LMU's Bellarmine Forum, I should necessarily talk about this. Though what I will say is LMU should divest from fossil fuels. We should have done it a long time ago. But if you'd like, Julia, I'd be more than happy to meet with you and or your group. And if I can, I'll try to put you in touch with some of the activists that are most focused on the fossil fuel pollution. What they're doing about it. It would be wonderful if I could make that connection. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Thank you.
Very important question.
Yes, thank you, Julia. Thank you for your work on this important matter. It is extremely important. And I know the Faculty Senate has passed a while, and a few of us on this planning committee are part of that. And yes, it needs to happen. I'm going to turn it back to Rachel. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Kim. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Evelyn. Dr. McDonald, I should say.
Yeah. Thanks again, Dr. Kim, and all of our students, and Evelyn McDonald for moderating the Q&A. I know we're just about out of time. We probably have 30 seconds left. I'll just say a couple things regarding Divest LMU. We are, Julia, going to try to bring more attention to your efforts. I know that the university has pledged to divest, I think, on a 5-year timeline. I could be wrong, maybe it's 10. Frankly, one of the objectives, I hope, of this Bellarmine Forum, or one of the achievements, is actually maybe getting that timeline to be a little shorter. So we want to continue to talk about that this semester, so that you can gain more support from your fellow students, and we can put maybe more pressure on that timeline. But the university has pledged to divest, but perhaps that timeline could be a little faster. So great question. So lastly, again, thanks to everybody. I just want to let everybody know that our next event is going to be our first in-person but hybrid event on February 14th, Valentine's Day. We're going to be hearing from student journalists who are part of a project called Climate 360. They're going to be debuting a documentary that they've made about climate change and talking about their experiences reporting on this issue. Again, that's on the 14th at 2:30 for those of you who are not part of these Bellarmine Forum courses. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for taking time.
Thank you.
Very thought-provoking presentation. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon and evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.